My family left me a rotting shack they thought was worthless. They were laughing then, but they aren't laughing now, not after what I found buried in the walls. My name is Maya Calloway, and just a few months ago, at 21 years old, my world had collapsed into a single, humiliating moment under the buzzing fluorescent lights of a coffee shop. Their coffee shop. The little bell over the door of the Daily Grind tinkled, a sound I used to associate with the comforting rush of caffeine and neighborhood chatter. That day, it sounded like a death knell. My cousin Chloe, her lips painted a severe shade of crimson that always made her look like she'd been sipping venom, stood with her arms crossed. Her brother, Ben, leaned against the gleaming espresso machine, a smirk playing on his face. He polished a portafilter with a rag, the rhythmic squeaking a counterpoint to my hammering heart. "Maya," Chloe began, her voice dripping with the kind of condescending sweetness that was far more insulting than outright anger. "We need to have a little chat." I stopped wiping down the pastry case, the scent of sugar and stale croissants suddenly nauseating. I knew this tone. It was the same one she used as a child, right before she'd tell a teacher I was the one who broke the window. "What's wrong?" I asked, my voice small. "It's just not working out," she said, gesturing vaguely around the shop, at the very tables I had just finished cleaning. "Ben and I have been talking. The business needs to move in a more professional direction. We need staff who are 110% committed. People with real ambition." The implication hung in the air, thick and suffocating. I, who worked 60 hours a week for them, who covered every sick day, who came in early and stayed late for less than minimum wage because we were family, lacked ambition. I looked at Ben, hoping for some kind of support, but he just shrugged, his eyes avoiding mine. "I don't understand," I whispered, though I understood perfectly. "I do everything you ask." "That's the problem, Maya," Ben finally piped up, setting the polished metal down with a sharp clink. "You just do what you're asked. You don't have any drive. You're just here. We're trying to build an empire and you're just treading water." An empire? They called their 10-table coffee shop, funded entirely by their parents, an empire. The absurdity of it would have been funny if my stomach wasn't trying to crawl up my throat. I had been treading water, but only because they had been holding my head under since the day I started. So I'm fired. The words felt like sandpaper in my mouth. Chloe gave a delicate sigh, as if I were a difficult toddler. "We're letting you go. It's for the best. It'll force you to, find your own way. Sink or swim." She smiled, a bright, predatory flash of white teeth. "Consider it a gift. A little push out of the nest." The final, brutal twist of the knife came 3 days later. A formal typewritten notice was taped to the door of the small apartment I rented. It was a unit in a building my uncle, Chloe and Ben's father, owned. The notice informed me that my lease was being terminated due to renovations, and I had 1 week to vacate the premises. There were no renovations planned. It was a coordinated, familial expulsion. They weren't just pushing me out of the nest. They were setting the nest on fire. I stood in my tiny living room, surrounded by boxes filled with a life that suddenly had no place to go. I had a few $100s to my name. Not enough for a security deposit and first month's rent, not in our overpriced town. My parents were gone, lost in a car accident years ago, and the rest of my so-called family had just made their position crystal clear. I was 21 years old, and I was about to be homeless in the only town I had ever known. The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot, burning shame that settled deep in my chest. I saw Chloe and Ben's laughing faces everywhere. I heard their mocking voices in my head. Sink or swim. They had thrown me into the ocean with lead weights tied to my ankles. Packing was a bleak affair. I sold my few pieces of cheap furniture for pennies on the dollar, just to have a little more cash. I packed my clothes, a handful of books, and a small box of sentimental items. Photos of my parents, my mother's favorite scarf, my father's old watch. Everything I owned in the world now fit into the trunk of my beat-up, 20-year-old sedan. On the final day, I handed the keys to the building superintendent, a grim-faced man who couldn't quite meet my eye. He knew what was happening. Everyone knew. The Calloway family drama was local sport. As I walked away from the building, I glanced across the town square. There it was, the daily grind, its cheerful sign a monument to my failure. Through the window, I could see Chloe laughing with a customer. She looked happy, free. I got in my car and drove. I had no destination. I just drove through the familiar streets, each corner holding a memory that now felt tainted. I drove past the park where we'd all played as kids, past the school, past the cinema. As dusk began to settle, tinting the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange, desperation began to set in. I couldn't afford a motel for more than a couple of nights. I had no friends I could burden with this. I was truly, utterly alone. And then I saw it. At the end of a long, forgotten road on the outskirts of town, half swallowed by overgrown ivy and shadowed by ancient, skeletal oaks. Blackwood Manor. It had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember, a local legend, a haunted house where teenagers dared each other to spend the night. We had played there as kids, me and Chloe and Ben, chasing each other through the cavernous, dusty rooms, our laughter echoing in the empty halls. It was a ruin, a magnificent, Gothic ruin. The roof sagged in the middle, like a broken spine. Windows were boarded up or shattered, black mouths gaping open to the elements. The grand front porch, tilted at a drunken angle, its white paint peeled away to reveal rotting grey wood beneath. The gardens were a chaotic jungle of weeds and thorny bushes. It was perfect. No one would look for me there. No one would care. It was a place to exist, a place to hide from the world that had so thoroughly rejected me, a place to sink without anyone watching. I pulled my car down the long, cracked driveway, the tires crunching over gravel and fallen leaves. The air grew cooler under the canopy of the old trees. The smell was the first thing that hit me when I stepped out of the car. A thick, earthy perfume of decay, of damp soil, wet stone, and generations of fallen leaves turning back into earth. It was the smell of time itself. The front door was massive, made of dark, heavy oak and locked tight. But to the side, one of the tall, arched windows on the ground floor had been broken long ago. The plywood that once covered it had rotted through, leaving a gap just large enough to squeeze through. I hesitated for only a moment, the last vestiges of my civilized self screaming about trespassing. Then I remembered Chloe's smile, the eviction notice, the emptiness of my bank account. I had nothing left to lose. I tossed my backpack through the opening first, then carefully, awkwardly, hoisted myself over the jagged sill. I landed inside with a soft thud on a carpet of dust and debris, sending motes dancing in the single beam of moonlight that pierced the gloom. The air inside was even thicker, colder, and more still. It was heavy with the scent of mold, of crumbling plaster, and the faint, musky odour of small animals that had made the house their own. My footsteps echoed unnervingly in the grand foyer. A sweeping staircase, its banister thick with cobwebs, curved up into darkness. A massive, tarnished chandelier hung precariously from the high ceiling, its crystals clouded with a century of grime. It was worse than I remembered. Far worse. The childish thrill of exploring a haunted house was gone, replaced by the grim reality of my situation. This wasn't an adventure. This was my shelter. This rotting, forgotten place was my new home. I spent the first hour doing a cautious survey, using the flashlight on my phone. The scale of the decay was breathtaking. Wallpaper peeled from the walls in long, curling strips, revealing damp, stained plaster beneath. In the grand ballroom, A section of the ceiling had collapsed, leaving a pile of rubble and a gaping hole to the sky. Rainwater had warped the hardwood floors into a miniature mountain range. Furniture, what little was left of it, was draped in white cloths that had turned grey with age, looking like ghostly apparitions in the narrow beam of my light. Despite the ruin, I could see the ghost of its former grandeur, the high ceilings, the intricate woodwork, the marble fireplace in the study. This had been a place of immense wealth and beauty. Now, it was a tomb. I found a small, relatively intact room off the main kitchen, probably a servant's pantry. The window was boarded up tight, which meant it was dark, but also dry and free of drafts. The floor was stone and cleaner than the rest of the house. I swept a small area with a piece of cardboard, laid down a few old blankets I'd brought, and curled up with my backpack as a pillow. That first night was the longest of my life. Every creak of the old house was a footstep. Every gust of wind rattling the window panes was a ghostly whisper. I lay there in the suffocating darkness, shivering more from fear and despair than from the cold. The full weight of my failure pressed down on me. My cousins had been right. I was nothing. I had sunk. And this cold, dark, decaying house was the bottom of the ocean. The next few days blurred into a miserable routine of survival. I found a working spigot on the side of the house for water. I ate the cheap granola bars and crackers I had in my car, rationing them carefully. I spent most of my time huddled in the pantry, reading by flashlight until the batteries died, trying to escape into fictional worlds because my own was unbearable. The loneliness was a physical ache. The silence of the house was immense, broken only by the sounds of its slow collapse. I felt like the last person on earth. I would sometimes walk to the edge of the overgrown property and look down the hill toward the town. A string of distant, glittering lights that represented a world I was no longer a part of. I could see the faint glow of the town square, and I knew that just there, in that warm, bright place, Chloe and Ben were serving coffee, laughing, living a life that had no room for me. The bitterness was a constant, metallic taste in my mouth. About a week into my squalid new existence, I ran out of food. Hunger gnawed at me, a dull, persistent pain that made it hard to think. I had to do something. I decided to start a more thorough search of the house, not for ghosts or adventure, but for anything of value I could possibly sell. An old silver candlestick, a piece of brass, anything. It felt like robbing a grave, but my desperation overrode my guilt. I started in the grand study on the ground floor. It was in better shape than many of the other rooms. The tall, built-in bookshelves were still lined with rotting books, their leather covers crumbling to dust at a touch. A massive mahogany desk stood in the center of the room, coated in a thick, velvety layer of grime. The air smelled of paper decay, a dry, academic sort of rot. I spent hours going through the room, prying open stuck drawers, sifting through mouldy papers that disintegrated in my hands. I found nothing but cancelled checks from the 1920s and stationery yellowed with age. My hope, already a fragile thing, began to wither. This was pointless. The house had been picked clean by looters and vandals decades ago. Defeated, I slumped against a wall near the fireplace. My hand slid down the grimy wood paneling, and I felt something. A small, sharp edge under my fingers. A nail. I looked closer. It was holding up the corner of a dark, square object that was almost completely obscured by dirt and shadows. My curiosity, a feeling I hadn't experienced in what felt like a lifetime, stirred. I used the hem of my shirt to wipe away the thick layer of grime. As the dirt came away, an image began to emerge. It was an old, sepia-toned photograph in a simple wooden frame. It depicted a man, tall and severe, with a thick mustache and eyes that seemed to stare right through the camera, through the decades, and directly at me. He wore a sharp three-piece suit and stood proudly, his hand resting on the newel post of a grand staircase. Behind him, sunlight streamed through an arched window. My breath caught in my throat. I knew that staircase. I knew that window. It was the foyer of this very house, but it wasn't the decaying, cobweb-draped wreck I was standing in. It was new, pristine, gleaming. The man was standing in Blackwood Manor in its prime, but it was his face that made my heart stop. I had seen that face before. It was older, sterner, but the set of the jaw, the shape of the eyes. It was my father's face. It was my face. I scrambled back to my car, my hands shaking, and retrieved the small box of my parents' things. I pulled out an old photo album and flipped through the pages until I found it. A picture of my grandfather, Arthur Calloway, as a young man. I held the two images side by side in the dim light. They were not the same man. The man in the photograph on the wall was older, from an earlier generation, but the resemblance was undeniable. It was a family resemblance. This man was a Calloway, and he was standing in this house as if he owned it. A frantic energy, an electrifying jolt of adrenaline shot through me. This wasn't just a random abandoned house. There was a connection. A piece of my own history was hidden in these rotting walls. My search was no longer for something to sell. It was for an answer. What was my family's connection to this place? Why had no one ever mentioned it? The story I'd always been told was that our branch of the family had always been the poor relations, the working class side that never got the leg up the others did. I returned to the study, my eyes scanning the room with a new, feverish intensity. The massive mahogany desk drew my attention again. It was a fortress, solid and imposing. I had pulled on all the drawers, but they were empty. It felt too simple. A desk this grand, in a house this important, had to have a secret. I began to examine it, not as a piece of furniture, but as a puzzle. I ran my hands over every inch of its surface, feeling for seams, for catches, for anything out of place. I was a restorer by nature, even if I'd only ever applied it to cheap furniture and broken appliances. I had an eye for how things were put together. My fingers traced the intricate carving along the base, and I felt it, a tiny, almost imperceptible give in one of the wooden rosettes. It wasn't solid, it was a button. My heart hammered against my ribs. I pressed it. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a low, groaning click, a section of the side panelling popped open, revealing not a drawer, but a dark, narrow cavity. My hands trembled as I reached inside. My fingers brushed against something cool and smooth. Leather. I pulled it out. It was a heavy, leather-bound folio, tied shut with a faded ribbon. It was incredibly well preserved, protected from the damp and decay that had claimed the rest of the room. The air it displaced smelled of old, expensive paper and time. I sat on the dusty floor, my flashlight propped up on a stack of crumbling books, and carefully untied the ribbon. The leather cover creaked open like a coffin lid. Inside, nestled in protective vellum, was a stack of documents. The top one was thick, heavy paper, covered in elegant, looping calligraphy. At the top, in bold, formal script, were the words, "Deed of Title," and below it, "The Blackwood Estate." My eyes scanned the document, my mind struggling to process the legal jargon. I saw dates from the late 1800s. I saw survey maps and property lines that encompassed not just the house but acres of the surrounding woodland. And then I saw the name, the registered owner, Alistair Calloway, my great-grandfather. I stared at the name, a roaring in my ears. My great-grandfather had owned Blackwood Manor. This entire estate had belonged to my family. A storm of questions erupted in my mind. Why was it abandoned? Why did we never know? Why were we the poor branch of the family if our ancestor had owned all this? I dug deeper into the folio. There were tax receipts, all paid, up until 1932. There were architectural drawings, the original blueprints for the house. And then I found the next crucial document, Alistair Calloway's last will and testament. It was a simple document. He left some minor assets to his other children, but the bulk of his estate, including the property and all holdings listed as the Blackwood estate, he left to his beloved son, Arthur Calloway, my grandfather, the young man from the photo album. I kept digging, my fingers flying through the brittle pages. I was looking for the next link in the chain, the document that showed the transfer of the property out of the family. A record of sale, a notice of foreclosure. Anything. There was nothing. The paper trail simply stopped. Arthur Calloway was listed as the heir, but there was no signature, no stamp, no legal filing to show that he had ever formally taken possession or that it had ever been sold or transferred to anyone else. According to this folio, the legal ownership of Blackwood Manor had been left in a state of suspended animation for nearly a century. Tucked at the very bottom of the folio, I found a thin bundle of personal letters tied with a black silk ribbon. They were between Alistair and Arthur. I read them under the beam of my dying flashlight, my breath held tight in my chest. The letters painted a vivid, tragic picture. Alistair was a man who had built a fortune from nothing. He adored his son Arthur, who, unlike his other children, showed no interest in money or status. Arthur was a scholar, a dreamer, a man of quiet integrity. Alistair's other children, the ancestors of my cousins Chloe and Ben, were a source of constant disappointment to him. He called them vultures in waiting, grasping and short-sighted, people who understood the price of everything and the value of nothing. The family feud wasn't new, it was generational. He wrote of his plan to leave the estate to Arthur, to ensure it stayed in the hands of someone who would appreciate its beauty and history, not just its monetary worth. But fate had intervened. The final letter was not from Alistair, but from his lawyer, dated 1931. It was a letter of condolence, informing Alistair of the sudden, tragic death of his son Arthur in a factory accident. My grandfather had died before he could inherit. The last document was a doctor's note. Alistair Calloway had died of a heart attack less than 2 months later. Heartbroken, he had followed his favourite son to the grave, leaving the legal transfer of his greatest asset in limbo. The greedy side of the family, the one that spawned my cousins, must have taken what cash and stocks they could. They were too lazy, too arrogant, and too ignorant to do the hard work of untangling the estate's legal status. They probably assumed the house was lost to back taxes or seized by the bank. They didn't care about the house itself, only what it could be liquidated for. So they forgot. They let it rot, a monument to their own short-sighted greed. I sat there in the darkness, the folio in my lap, the weight of 100 years of history settling on my shoulders. It wasn't a curse or a cruel joke. It was an accident of history, a tragedy that had, through a bizarre twist of fate, preserved this house for me. Because as I sat there, the legal implications began to dawn on my 21-year-old, non-lawyer brain. If Alistair left the house to Arthur, and Arthur died without formally accepting it or having children of his own at the time, the inheritance would pass down the line. But my father was Arthur's son, born from a later marriage I knew little about. And my father was gone, and I was his only child. The chain of title, broken and forgotten for almost a century, led directly to me. I wasn't a squatter. I wasn't a trespasser. I was home. The next morning I walked out of the house a different person. The despair was gone, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. The air smelled the same, the decay was just as profound, but I saw it all with new eyes. This wasn't a ruin, it was a project. This wasn't a burden, It was an opportunity. This was my legacy. I took the folio, wrapped it carefully, and walked the 5 miles into town. I looked like a ghost. My clothes were filthy, my hair was matted, and I hadn't had a real meal in days. But I walked with a purpose I hadn't felt in my entire life. I went straight to the oldest law firm in town, a dusty office with the name Miller & Sons, established 1920 in faded gold leaf on the window. Mr. Miller III was a man in his 70s, with kind eyes and a face as wrinkled as a topographical map. He looked at my disheveled appearance with professional neutrality, but a flicker of sympathy showed when I introduced myself. He remembered my father. I didn't say much. I just opened the leather folio on his wide oak desk and let the documents speak for themselves. He spent the next 2 hours in complete silence, poring over every page with a magnifying glass. He read the deeds, the will, the letters. He made phone calls to the county records office, his voice a low, authoritative murmur. Finally, he leaned back in his leather chair, took off his glasses, and looked at me. "Miss Calloway," he said, his voice filled with a sense of awe. "By all that is holy, the line of succession is clear, if unconventional. The property was never entered into probate after your grandfather's death. The other heirs never filed a claim, and the county never foreclosed for taxes, because a trust Alistair set up for that specific purpose has been quietly paying the minimums for 90 years. It's a miracle of bureaucratic oversight. This house, this entire estate, it's yours, clean and clear." The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. It was real. I hadn't been hallucinating from hunger and despair. I was the legal owner of Blackwood Manor. "What do I do now?" I asked, my voice trembling. Mr. Miller smiled, a genuine, warm smile. "First, we get you a hot meal and a decent place to sleep. Then, we go to the bank. This," he said, tapping the ancient deed, "is not just a piece of paper. It's collateral. It's power." The next few weeks were a blur of activity. Mr. Miller became my guide and my champion. He helped me file the paperwork to have the title officially and indisputably transferred to my name. Then he walked me into the main bank in town, the same bank where my cousins had their paltry business loan, and introduced me to the bank president. The president, a man who wouldn't have given me the time of day a month ago, looked at the official property appraisal and the certified deed with wide, avaricious eyes. The land alone was worth millions. The decrepit house was a liability, but the potential was undeniable. They didn't just give me a loan, they offered me a line of credit that made my head spin. It was more money than my family had probably seen in 3 generations. My first act was to pay Mr. Miller a handsome retainer. My second was to buy myself new clothes and rent a small, clean apartment in town. My third, and most satisfying, was to hire the best architectural restoration firm in the state. The transformation of Blackwood Manor began. The first thing to arrive was a huge sign hammered into the front lawn, "Future site of the Calloway Hotel. Restoration in progress." From the window of their coffee shop across the square, Chloe and Ben had a front row seat. I saw them standing outside, their arms crossed, staring up the hill at the activity. Their faces were a perfect picture of disbelief and fury. The work was my entire life. I was on site from dawn until dusk. I wasn't just the owner, I was the project manager. My innate, practical skills, the ones my cousins had mocked as a lack of ambition, were exactly what was needed. I knew how things worked. I knew how to fix things. I worked alongside the crews, learning about plumbing, electrical, masonry. I made every decision, from the slate on the roof to the thread count of the sheets. I wasn't just restoring a house, I was reclaiming my history and building my future. The smell of decay was replaced by the clean scent of fresh-cut lumber and paint. The sound of creaking rot was replaced by the music of saws and hammers. The house came alive, and so did I. The ballroom floor was sanded and polished back to a mirror shine. The broken chandelier was sent to a specialist in New York and returned, its crystals sparkling like diamonds. The overgrown gardens were tamed, revealing elegant stone pathways and a forgotten rose garden. I poured every ounce of myself and a considerable amount of the bank's money into making it perfect. It would not just be a hotel, it would be a destination. A testament to a grandeur that my family had forgotten and that I had unearthed. The local paper ran a front-page story. Local woman inherits lost Calloway fortune, revives Blackwood Manor. It told the whole story, the forgotten deeds, the tragic history, my unlikely discovery. It painted me as a hometown Cinderella. It painted my cousins, by omission, as the ugly stepsisters. Their business, which relied on local goodwill, began to suffer. People started looking at them differently. The grand opening of the Calloway Hotel was set for a crisp Saturday in October, 1 year to the day after I had been fired. The entire town was buzzing. We were booked solid for the next 6 months. Luxury cars I'd only ever seen in magazines lined the newly paved driveway. A string quartet played on the veranda where I had once squeezed through a broken window. I stood in the gleaming foyer, by the same newel post where my great-grandfather had stood for his photograph. I wore a simple, elegant black dress that had cost more than my old car. I watched as the town's elite, the people who had once pitied or scorned me, streamed through the doors, their faces masks of awe. The hotel was more beautiful than I had ever imagined. It was alive, filled with laughter and light and the clinking of champagne glasses. Then, through the crowd, I saw them, Chloe and Ben. They stood just inside the doorway, looking lost and small. Their clothes, which had once seemed so stylish, now looked cheap and dated in the opulent surroundings. They were staring, not at the hotel, but at me. They pushed their way through the crowd, their faces grim. All the envy and resentment they had been stewing in for a year was boiling over. "Maya!" Chloe hissed, her voice low and venomous. "We need to talk." "Chloe, Ben," I said, my voice calm and even. I felt nothing, no fear, no anger. Just a vast, quiet distance. "Welcome to the Calloway. Can I get you a drink?" "Don't play games," Ben snapped, his face flushed. "How did you do this? This house was a ruin. It was nothing. You were nothing." "It wasn't nothing," I said softly. "It just needed someone to see what was really there. Someone willing to do the work." Chloe's face twisted into a mask of righteous fury. "This is our family history, our great-grandfather. You stole this from us. You must have cheated, forged those papers." I almost laughed. It was so perfectly them. Unable to comprehend a world where success was earned through anything other than deceit or inheritance. "The papers are a matter of public record, Chloe. Mr. Miller would be happy to explain the legal principle of primogeniture to you, but I suspect you'd be bored. The simple truth is, your ancestors were too greedy and lazy to care about this house, so it fell to the branch of the family that did. It fell to me." Their anger seemed to deflate, replaced by a desperate, grasping panic. They saw their own mediocrity reflected in my success, and it terrified them. "We're family, Maya," Ben said, his voice suddenly pleading. It was the most pathetic sound I had ever heard. "You can't just cut us out. We're struggling. The shop, people aren't coming in like they used to. You could help us. You owe us that." "Owe you?" The word was quiet, but it cut through the nearby chatter. I let the silence hang for a moment, letting them squirm. "Yes, you could make the coffee shop the official cafe for the hotel. We could cater your events. It would save us," Chloe said, her eyes wide and desperate. "It's the least you could do for your family." I looked at them, at their pinched, entitled faces. I saw the girl who had mocked me, the boy who had stood by and let it happen. I saw the eviction notice and I felt the cold stone floor of the pantry where I'd slept, hungry and alone. I gave them a small, serene smile. "You're right. You are family, and you already gave me everything I could ever need." Their faces flickered with confused hope. "You gave me a push out of the nest," I said, using her own words, and I saw her flinch. "You taught me that I couldn't rely on anyone but myself. You fired me from a dead-end job and forced me to find my own way. You made me homeless, and in doing so, you sent me to the one place on earth where my fortune was waiting. I owe my entire success to you." The blood drained from their faces as they understood. "So, thank you," I continued, my voice as smooth as glass. "But the Calloway Hotel has its own 5-star restaurant and cafe. We have no need to outsource." I reached into the pocket of my dress and pulled out a business card. "However, our housekeeping department is still hiring. If you fill out an application, I'll make sure it gets to the right person." I placed the card in Ben's limp hand. For a long, silent moment, they just stared at me, their mouths opening and closing like fish. The public, humiliating rejection was more than they could process. Then, without another word, I turned my back on them. I walked away, into the heart of the party, into the center of the life I had built, from the rubble of the one they had destroyed. I didn't look back. I heard the great oak doors of the hotel swing shut behind them, a solid, satisfying sound that locked out the past forever. Across the square, the lights of their little shop seemed dimmer than ever, a flickering candle in the brilliant, blazing light of my empire. They had wanted me to sink or swim, and from the ashes of their cruelty I had learned to fly.